Hello and welcome to Christie's in London and King Street. I'm Jacky Klein, I'm an art historian, and I'm delighted to be able to give you a very quick tour today, wherever you're joining us from, of the highlights of 3 different sets of sales: Impressionist pictures, modern and contemporary. And there are now 8 auctions that are happening over the next couple of weeks here in London. So if you can and you get a chance to come to the auction house, please do. But we would love to know as well where you're tuning in from today, because it may be somewhere on the other side of the world. Now, there are 3 things I want you to take note of today: 2 big themes and 1 big artist. The first big theme is the nude in painting, and we'll see lots of those as we walk through the galleries. The second one is a very fine line that we're going to see between abstraction and figuration in a lot of modern art. And the third theme, or artist if you like, is probably the single most important figure in 20th century painting and potentially sculpture, and that is Picasso, which is where I want to start us today. In fact, this rather majestic painting of a seated nude and a musketeer from 1967. We're starting at the end of Picasso's life, but this actually encapsulates both of those themes that I've already touched on. The nude we have here, the seated nude next to the clothed musketeer. And as you can see, this is a figurative painting in the broadest sense. It's very gestural. We can see 2 figures, but there are passages of almost abstraction, this sort of fuzzy, almost bubbly quality of the background. Now, Picasso, we know, loved sort of archetypal figures, and he used lots of them in his art. So figures like the Harlequin, or the torero, or the, well, in this case, the cavalier or the musketeer. And he sort of took those tropes, if you like, often from literature, and used himself as a kind of stand-in for these figures. So here, what we have, actually late in life, is Picasso himself and his wife, Jacqueline. We know it's Jacqueline because at this period of his life they had been together for many years, but also she has this sort of amazing swathe of dark raven hair, the almond-shaped eyes, which were very, very typical, and this long, sort of very elegant aquiline nose. So in a sense, this is a sort of self-portrait, but it's a very exuberant self-portrait. You have to remember that here, Picasso was, can you believe it, 85 years old. This is not a picture of a young man, and yet it's full of passion and intensity and eroticism, particularly here with the handling of Jacqueline's body, very, very brazen and very open to the viewer, as she looks sort of adoringly at him and he looks out at us, the viewer. Picasso did once say that for him, art and eroticism were basically the same thing. There was no difference. But I think what you get here very late in life is that sense of not just vitality and energy, but almost a kind of explosive urge to create as he headed towards the end of his life. He said, there's more and more that I see, and there's more and more that I want to do every day as he approached old age. This picture was made after a period of illness in 1965, when Picasso had been constrained to staying at home. He hadn't been able to work much, and he went back to a lot of the literary sources that so inspired him, everything from Shakespeare to Balzac, and of course here, Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers. And so in 1967, when he gets back to painting, we see the canvases sort of bristling with these musketeer figures. Also, though, importantly, Picasso was one of those artists who constantly looked backwards, and Rembrandt, I think, is a very important touchstone here, because not only did Rembrandt paint cavaliers and musketeers, but we know that at the time this picture was made, Picasso liked to project a slide on the studio wall of Rembrandt's major painting from Amsterdam, The Night Watch, and you can just imagine those figures of the sort of guards, the cavaliers at the edge, spilling onto the studio wall as he painted this. As I said, we're going to sort of work backwards in a way as we look at Picasso today, because that's the end of his life in his mid-80s. But let's jump back 10 years or so to this wonderful picture. This again is Jacqueline, his wife, but this is only 2 years into what would be their 20-year relationship. And again, a much simpler picture in a way from the 1950s, but we have Jacqueline in this very traditional pose, again making reference back to other artists like Degas and also Ingres and Titian. She's doing her hair, her coiffure. And again, that wonderful shock of raven black hair, I think, is one of the most important features of this jewel-like picture. The black and white only goes, I think, to sort of offset that amazing emerald green dress. And although this, again, is a very clearly figurative picture, you know, the sort of bits of the body are all over the place. One of her breasts here coming off at the side against this lovely chair, one of the wicker chairs that we know was in his studio that he painted from repeatedly. Jacqueline was a young woman when he met her in 1952, and they met at the studio, the ceramic studio in Vallauris, where Picasso made a lot of his ceramics and where Jacqueline was at the time working as a sales assistant. But of course this was Picasso, nothing was straightforward in his love life, and at the time he met Jacqueline he was still with Françoise Gillot, who was the mother of his 2 children. But really this marked the beginning of that 20-year relationship with Jacqueline, who would probably become the single most important muse in his life. He was certainly with her the longest. And I just think this is a wonderful picture of her looking very sensuous and again looking sort of lovingly out of the canvas at us, the viewer, but of course into Picasso's eyes. From one wife, let's head back in time to his first wife, and that's Olga, who was a Russian ballet dancer. This is a completely different sort of picture, and I think what's amazing in these sales at the moment is that just in these few galleries you can see pretty much a picture from every one of Picasso's most important periods, from the very early Rose period all the way through to that very late exuberant nude. Here, this is 1919, it's August and it's summertime, as you can see, and this is a still life in front of a balcony. Now, Picasso had been in London for some months and he had just returned to France, and he took Olga, his young wife, on a holiday on the French Riviera to a small town where they stayed at the rather luxurious Hotel Continental. And this was the view from their window out across the blue Mediterranean Sea. What I want you to look at, particularly with this picture, is again that blending of styles, that mix between abstraction and figuration. Because if you remember, in the First World War, 1914 to 18, and just before that, Picasso had been really the chief architect of this new wave of art and this new movement called Cubism. And the Cubist pictures, which had so inspired him before the war, are much tamed here. There is still a Cubist still life here on the table. You can see the guitar here and a bowl of fruit, and then the other elements in the picture become more abstracted. But set against this abstract Cubist still life, you have a very naturalistic backdrop of the sky and the sea and the iron balustrade. And this was the moment of something called the return to order in Europe. This is where the very radical artists of the First World War had suddenly stepped back from the brink of the real radicalism that had pushed them in those years up to the war. They'd seen the horrors of what war had brought, and they had decided to sort of retreat to a more sort of formal, classicist, calm, and in a way backward-looking art. But only backward-looking in the sense that it referred to older, more traditional forms of representation. But Picasso here, the absolute master, if you like, of playing with those different types of art. This is as much a painting about painting as it is a sort of love song to his new wife, because it offsets the Cubist foreground with the representational, more classical background. And I think a really very important picture. We're going to more Picasso. Don't worry, there will be other artists. And if you've just joined us, we are here at Christie's in London's King Street. I'm Jacky Klein, and I'm showing you some of the highlights of the sales happening over the next 2 weeks of Impressionist, modern and contemporary works. I want to take you over here next to another wonderful Picasso. We just saw the aftermath of the First World War. This phenomenal, strange picture is the aftermath of the Second World War. I'm not going to tell you its title just yet, because what I want you to notice is that when you stand at a distance, this picture looks incredibly abstract. There's swathes of colour, we've got the blue, the white, the black, the grey and the red, a very limited, simple palette. But actually, when you start to look more closely, and particularly when you notice the title, The Bled Cockerel, you start to see what's going on here, and it's actually rather gruesome and in a way quite sinister. I'll point out a few elements. So what we have here is splayed on a table the body, the carcass of a rooster. These red spots, I think, must be where the feathers have been plucked. And here, as you follow this black line down, you can see the chicken's head and a sort of open mouth, almost the scream of death. And here on the table, this must be the knife that has just ended this poor rooster's life. And here, a bowl of what I can only imagine must be blood, the bled cockerel. This painting was made on two very specific dates, the 27th of February 1947 and the 13th of October 1948. So 2 dates. He obviously returned to the picture more than a year after he started it. Now, Picasso stayed in Paris during the Second World War. Of course, it came under Nazi occupation, and while he didn't suffer anything like what so many hundreds of thousands, millions of people suffered under the hands of the Nazis, he did suffer deprivations. The Nazis came and raided his studio many times. He had very sparse materials, and he painted a series of really incredible still lives that, if you like, are sort of stand-ins for this idea of the war and the despair and the lack of hope. This painting made, of course, in the aftermath of the war, but there were still deprivations in continental Europe, of course, as there were in the UK. And I think what's interesting here is that Picasso chose a lot of animals in his life: the bull, the horse, here the cockerel, and of course the French rooster is the symbol of national identity in France. And he chose it to show it completely sort of emasculated. This is not a virile, strong image. This is the poor rooster sort of splayed and lying dead on the table, almost on the surface, if you like, of continental Europe in the aftermath of war. And he said, I didn't go out and choose to paint the war, but I think the war is there in these pictures. And I think that's absolutely right. It's very unusual in being quite so abstract. I said I was going to show you some other artists, and now is the time for us to go and see a few different pictures in this wonderful gallery at Christie's. Let's turn firstly to this little jewel-like picture. Again, from a distance, it looks very much like a completely abstract picture. But as you zoom in there, you start to realise that this is, in fact, not completely abstract. In fact, it's a landscape painting, and this is by the Russian artist Vasily Kandinsky. It was made in 1910 in a place called Murnau in Bavaria in southern Germany. And it was a place that Kandinsky absolutely adored. It was a pivotal place, and this, 1910, a really pivotal moment for his career. Because as a young artist, he'd been inspired by Van Gogh and by Gauguin and made very representational pictures. But what happened in Murnau is that, inspired by the landscape, this was a place at the foothill of the Alps. It had beautiful rolling hills and moorland, and lots of people from nearby Munich would go there to take the fresh air, as did Kandinsky and his lover and fellow artist Gabriele Munter. They went there repeatedly from 1904, just a few years before this little picture was made. And importantly, you can see the scale of it is quite small. And this was painted, we know, on board, outdoors in the open air. Kandinsky would take these little boards and take his box of oil paints and go out into the landscape and take his inspiration there. And colour for him really was the sort of linchpin, the thing that helped him move, if you like, from representative, more traditional painting to very, very new abstract painting. He wanted to use completely unblended colours. You see these lovely swathes of emerald green, of sort of amber and yellow, and then the pinks and mauves in the background there. And there's a lovely story of how Kandinsky remembered, as a young boy, as a teenager, saving up money for his very, very first box of oil paints. And there's a wonderful story of him taking each paint out of the box, and as he did so, he actually felt that each had its own life, its own personality. One was sombre, one was disturbing, one was ethereal. These weren't just brown and blue and orange and red that you and I might see. And that sense that colour could communicate something of the sort of spiritual truth of the universe, something that lay behind and beyond what we can see with the naked eye, was absolutely at the heart of Kandinsky's work and what he wanted to evoke in us, in the viewer, that sort of sensation of colour. There are, as I said, some recognisable things here. There's some whitewashed houses just in the foothills here of the mountains, and up in the background, that red triangle is the church in Murnau near Kandinsky and Munter's home. I think really a quite wonderful picture. And I just wanted to read a very short quote. He said, "I sought, impossible though it might seem, to capture on the canvas the chorus of colours that nature, with staggering force, impressed upon my entire soul." I think it's an absolute gem of a picture. Now, before we move into a room where everything's going to get a little bit more strange and surreal, a quick glance at this picture. I mentioned that there are a number of nudes on show here. This is a nude by the Polish-French artist Balthus. It was painted in the 1970s, towards the later part of his life, and it's a majestic scale, but I wanted to show it to you because it's a very, very typical, almost archetypal painting by this artist. You have a young woman, a girl or a woman, just waking up from her sleep, holding this mechanical toy bird, which seems to have startled the cat here also into a moment of wakefulness. And the cat was used a lot by Balthus as a sort of metaphor, if you like, for female sexuality suddenly awakening. Anyway, a rather majestic picture on a huge scale, inspired, I think, a lot by Italian 14th century art, which Balthus had looked at a great deal when he lived in Italy. If you are just tuning in, this is a Facebook Live. I'm Jacky Klein, and we are broadcasting from Christie's auction house in London, where there are a series of half a dozen or so sales happening over the next couple of weeks. All sorts of wonderful pictures that we're going to waft past. There's Chagall's, there's Soutines, there's Jawlensky's. But if you follow me through this rather wonderful doorway, please take note because it's about to reappear in a picture that we're going to see. There is another major artist I wanted to introduce you to here. Many of you will know of him. And by the way, please do tell us not only where you're tuning in from, but which of these pictures takes your fancy, if you could choose one of them for your own room. Now, Magritte. Magritte was probably he was the most important Belgian surrealist, but he became one of the most important surrealists of all in Paris, where he moved in 1927. There's a series of pictures here, starting with this one, which were made in 1926, the year before he moved to Paris. And 26 was a very important year because he was working towards a major solo exhibition in the spring of 1927, and all of the pictures I'm going to show you were specifically made for that show. This picture is called The Silent Group, and you're going to have to come in and have a good look at it, because Magritte, we know now, was a sort of master of juxtaposition, of making everyday normal things appear strange simply by mashing them together in unexpected ways. But I think, interestingly, and this picture is an amazing example of it, he had something much more profound going on, and that was that he was trying to uncover for us the artifice of painting, and beyond that, the artifice, if you like, of everyday life and of perception and of what might constitute reality. In The Silent Group, we have here on the right a figure. And Magritte, too, at this moment, was trying to deconstruct the idea of the female nude. We don't know if this is a man or a woman. It's sort of neither, because it's a figure cut out of wood. Instead of being covered in flesh, instead what we have is a whole room, in this strange, slightly sickly, pinky flesh tone. The room has become human. The human has become a piece of architecture. This is very much a picture, as I said, about perception, about the act of looking, and nothing quite seems to fit. In the background, we have what looks like a curtain, and yet it seems to be made of stone. Attached to it is a sort of footbridge with a castle on it that seems to come and end nowhere. On the left, we've got a painting of a landscape, of some trees. But we know that it's artificial, not only because we're standing in front of the picture, but because in front of it there's a frame, and cut out of it are these three holes that sort of help you look through to the room beyond. To show the artifice even more, we've got a sort of theatre